I was still wearing his wedding band. Still sleeping on his side of the bed. Still whispering goodnight to a man who wasn't there. When Julia arrived, I thought she came to grieve. She didn't hug me. Didn't even look at me. She just placed a manila envelope on the table and said, "You need to read this." I remember the texture of it, heavy paper, slightly damp from her hand. My fingers wouldn't move. My throat tightened. The envelope wasn't addressed to me. But the name typed on the document inside was my husband's. And the signature at the bottom. His, too. But it wasn't the will we wrote together. It wasn't the one I watched him sign, just months before he died. This one left everything to her. The house. The business. Even the old piano he promised would stay in the family. My chest went hollow. My sister, my only sister, just stood there, arms crossed like it was some kind of business deal. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the pages. "He changed his mind," she said. "Said you weren't stable?" I didn't know what scared me more. The fact that she'd said that. Or the terrifying possibility that she believed it. But here's what I need to know. If he really left her everything, why was she hiding this will until after the funeral? I guess, to understand how all of this happened, you'd need to understand him. And her. And me. Daniel wasn't flashy. He didn't light up a room, he anchored it. He was the kind of man who made everything feel steady just by walking in the door. He wore quiet the way some people wear confidence. We met at a community fundraiser, of all places. He offered to carry boxes, then forgot to ask my name, twice. But he remembered what book I said I was reading. The next week, he left a note tucked inside the same title at the library. It said, "For what it's worth, I think you're the plot twist." I still keep that note in my wallet. He ran a small construction company with 5 employees and a dog named Murphy that came to the office every day. Nothing extravagant. Nothing showy. But everything he touched, he made solid. Trustworthy. That's how I knew what we had was real. Because even after 10 years together, Daniel still made promises he actually kept. And then, there's Julia. My sister. 2 years younger. Grew up in the same house, with the same parents, and somehow lived an entirely different life. She was magnetic, always has been. The type of person people forgave before she even apologized. Julia could charm her way out of a locked vault with a smirk and a story about how it was all just a misunderstanding. We were never close, not really. I think people assume sisters always are, but ours was a connection frayed by too many lies and too many half-truths. Still, there were moments when she laughed until she cried watching some terrible reality show. When she remembered to buy me lemon tea during my miscarriage and sat with me while I said nothing. She could be human. She just didn't stay that way. Julia had a habit of crashing into people's lives and expecting the wreckage to clean itself up. I spent my 20s being the cleanup crew. Bailing her out of bad credit. Co-signing an apartment she never paid rent on. Driving across state lines when she disappeared for 3 days without calling. And every time, she'd look at me with those glassy, wet eyes and say, "You're all I've got." And I'd believe her. But when I met Daniel, something shifted. He saw what that cycle was doing to me. He didn't try to take her place or push her out. He just held me accountable to the person I wanted to become. He made me stronger. Stronger and harder to manipulate. So, when Julia came back into our lives years later, out of the blue, I was cautious. But Daniel? He said maybe this time was different. Maybe people really do change. He told me. Let her in. Let her try. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe the girl who danced barefoot in our backyard growing up could be someone I could actually trust. So when Daniel got sick, and Julia showed up with a bag of groceries and her old sparkle, I let my guard down. Just a little. She cooked. She laughed. She sat beside his hospital bed and read to him. And in those weeks, I saw something in her I hadn't seen in years. Not love exactly, but something close. Or maybe I just needed to believe that. Because if I'd looked closer, if I hadn't been so wrapped in grief, in fear, in the slow fading of the man I loved, I might have noticed that every time Julia smiled, her eyes didn't. But I didn't look. And she knew that. God, she counted on it. It's strange how grief changes the way you see people. It blurs the lines, between love and need, between memory and hope. And in the haze of Daniel's illness, I started seeing Julia differently. She didn't come barging in, like she used to. She arrived quietly. Knocked instead of using her old key. Brought groceries, real ones, not just wine and crackers. She even remembered Daniel's favorite brand of peanut butter. I didn't know what to make of it. She smiled, but not too wide. She spoke gently. She looked me in the eye. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like chaos. She felt like company. The nights were the hardest. I was barely sleeping. Daniel had started coughing blood by then, and we knew, deep down, we were running out of options. I was trying to stay strong for him. For me. But I'd go days without eating. I'd forget what day it was. Julia noticed. One night, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It said, "Go take a nap. I've got the meds. I've got him. Just for a few hours, rest." She made tea. She lit candles. She even folded the laundry I hadn't touched in a week. All the little things I didn't realize I needed help with, she just did them. And I started to think, maybe this is the version of Julia that finally stayed. Maybe life knocked the wildness out of her. She would sit beside Daniel in the afternoons and read his favorite poems. Sometimes they'd just talk, in low voices. I didn't always hear what they said. But once, I heard him laugh. A real one. And that sound alone made me want to believe everything was going to be okay. She started helping with the paperwork, too. Hospital forms. Insurance nonsense. Things Daniel used to handle, but now looked like foreign languages to me. Julia said, "I used to date a lawyer, remember? Let me deal with the signatures and the fine print. You need to focus on him." And I did. I wanted to. Because every hour I wasn't at his side felt like stolen time. So I let her take over the background noise. The errands. The phone calls. The admin. She was careful not to push too hard. Every offer felt like a gesture, not an invasion. And slowly, without realizing it, I began depending on her. Not out of weakness. Out of exhaustion. I even started thanking her. Out loud. I remember once, we were sitting outside on the porch after Daniel had fallen asleep. The air smelled like burnt toast and fading lavender. I looked over and said, "I know things haven't always been easy between us. But I'm glad you're here." And she smiled, small, soft. Didn't gloat. Didn't say, "I told you so." She just nodded and said, "Me too." That moment stuck with me. Because for the first time, I let myself believe I wasn't alone in this. Not entirely. There was even a day, God, it feels so far away now. When Daniel looked at me, his voice barely a whisper, and said, "You girls, you're good together. I'm glad you have each other." I squeezed his hand. And I promised him I'd keep the peace. That I'd try. For him. And I meant it. So when Julia started asking more questions, about the will, about what he wanted, I didn't see it as odd. She framed it as concern. I just want to make sure you're protected, you know? Daniel mentioned something the other night. He seemed unsure about the business side of things. Maybe we should revisit the estate plan, just in case. I didn't like thinking about that stuff. He was still alive. Still breathing. Still holding my hand. But she was right. We needed to be prepared. And I trusted her. That's the part that breaks me now. Because when I look back, when I replay all those moments, I can see it. The way she studied me. Measured me. Chose her words so carefully. Not too soft. Not too sharp. She knew exactly how to earn my trust. And I gave it to her. Freely. Without question. Because in that chapter of my life, Julia didn't feel like a threat. She felt like a sister. And maybe that's the worst betrayal of all. Not the lie itself, but the moment you chose to believe it. At first, the changes were so subtle, I barely noticed. A missing note here. A paused conversation there. But grief makes you blind. And trust makes you deaf. It started with small things. Julia would glance over my shoulder while I paid bills. She'd offer to help. "You've got enough on your plate, let me take care of this." She began answering Daniel's phone more than I did. Told me the lawyer had nothing urgent to say. Told the hospice nurse to come an hour later without telling me. Little decisions. Always wrapped in convenience. I told myself she was just trying to help. That maybe I was overwhelmed. But then came the questions. And the opinions. "Are you sure Daniel would want you to keep the house? I mean, it's a lot for one person. You never really cared for the business side of things, right?" He mentioned he was thinking about reallocating some of the assets. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, watching Daniel sleep, thinking. What assets? Everything we built together. There were no secret accounts. No hidden treasures. Just love, loyalty, and a life slowly unraveling. Then one day, Julia stood in the kitchen with a file folder tucked under her arm. She said, "I met with Mr. Kane, Daniel's lawyer. Just wanted to make sure everything's in order." I blinked. "Why would you meet with him without me?" She smiled. "Because you'd cry through the whole thing, and someone needs to keep their head on straight." It stung. But I let it go. Because part of me feared she might be right. Another night, she casually mentioned, "You know, Daniel told me once that he didn't want you to worry about money. That if anything happened, he wanted to make sure I could help you." My stomach twisted. Not because it sounded unkind, but because it sounded off. Daniel never kept things from me. And Julia, she never talked about helping. Not unless it benefited her. The night she brought up the will, I froze. We were sitting in the den, drinking tea. The TV was playing one of Daniel's favorite old westerns in the background. She cleared her throat and said, "Have you looked at the final version yet?" I said, "The will?" "Yeah. It's the one we agreed on 2 years ago." She went quiet. Too quiet. Then she said, "Daniel made a few adjustments recently. Just little things. He mentioned them to me." I stared at her. "He never told me." She shrugged. "Well, maybe he didn't want to upset you." That moment sat like ice in my chest. Because Daniel never shielded me from truth, only from pain. And even then, not without talking to me first. Julia's tone began to change after that. Less gentle. More transactional. She'd say things like, "You know, it might make more sense if I handle the business accounts after." Or, "Once the estate settles, we'll figure out who gets what." We figure out. Who gets what? But there was no we. It was Daniel and me. Our house. Our life. Our plans. And yet somehow, she was already speaking like it was hers. One morning, I found her in Daniel's office, going through his desk drawers. She looked up and smiled. Just trying to make sense of all this paperwork. You've always hated this part. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. But inside, a quiet alarm began to ring. Low and slow. Not loud enough to panic, but impossible to ignore. Because something was shifting. Not in the air. In her. And I was starting to wonder if Julia ever came back for us. Or if she came back for something else entirely. There's a moment in grief when time goes soft. You don't know what day it is. You forget if you've eaten. You stand in a room and wonder why you walked in. After Daniel passed, that was my everyday. The world kept spinning, but I stayed still. Like a photo left behind in a moving car. I couldn't cry at the funeral. I just sat there, clutching the sleeve of his jacket like it was still part of him. And Julia. Julia was everywhere. She organized the catering. She booked the church. She answered the calls I couldn't face. People kept saying how lucky I was to have her. How selfless she was, stepping up like that. And maybe, for a little while, I believed it. She'd tuck me into bed like I was a child again. Bring me tea. Sit at the foot of the bed and hum softly, the way our mother used to when we were sick. There were nights I woke up gasping from a dream, and she was already standing in the doorway. Like she knew. That kind of closeness. It can blur your boundaries. Especially when you're aching for something to hold on to. I let her take over the finances. The phone calls with the lawyer. I stopped asking questions because I didn't have the energy to face the answers. I wanted to believe someone was taking care of me. Because I didn't know how to take care of myself anymore. But then things started shifting. Not loudly. Not all at once. More like the floorboards settling beneath your feet in a quiet room. Slight tilts in balance. I tried to ask Mr. Kane about the estate one day, just a simple question about the house title. He looked confused and said, "Didn't Julia already update you?" I hadn't heard anything. Another time, a letter from the bank arrived. I opened it and saw her name listed next to mine. Joint account. Authorized signatory. I confronted her. She didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Just said, "You weren't in any shape to deal with this. I needed access to keep things running. You would have done the same for me." Would I? I wanted to say yes. But something in her tone felt practiced. Like she'd rehearsed that answer. She started making comments. Innocent on the surface. But sharp if you looked closely. "You always hated numbers. Daniel used to say you couldn't even balance a checkbook. If something happened to you, who would even know where to start?" I laughed nervously the first few times. But the laughter got thinner. And the silences between us grew longer. One afternoon, I found her in Daniel's closet. She said she was organizing donations. But she'd already boxed up his watch. His wedding ring. Even the notes he used to leave me on the fridge. She said, "These things just make it harder. You need a fresh start." But I didn't ask for a fresh start. I didn't ask for any of this. Still, I nodded. Because the truth is, I didn't trust myself to push back. I didn't know where she ended and I began anymore. I had let her into my grief. And now she was everywhere. In the house. In the bank accounts. In the silence that followed every question I didn't dare ask. I started to wonder. Had she really come to help? Or had she come to build something out of my brokenness? And if so, what exactly had I handed her? Without even realizing it? There's a moment when grief begins to lift. Not all at once. Just slightly, like the fog rolling back from a field, letting in the first sharp outline of morning. I remember the first time I felt it. Weeks after the funeral. The silence wasn't as loud. The coffee didn't taste like cardboard. I caught myself humming while folding laundry, and for a moment, it startled me. I thought maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to heal. But healing is fragile. And betrayal has a way of slipping in just when you start to breathe again. It was a Tuesday when everything cracked open. I remember because the garden was full of bees, and Julia had just baked banana bread. She was wearing Daniel's old hoodie. She said it smelled like him. And something about that made my stomach turn. I walked into the kitchen. There was a manila envelope on the counter. Sealed. Neat handwriting across the front, to be opened privately. It wasn't addressed to me. Julia walked in, saw me holding it, and said, "Oh, you weren't supposed to see that yet." But her face didn't show surprise. No panic. Just calm, cold control. She took the envelope, opened it slowly, and laid the contents out on the table like it was a deck of cards. Legal paper. Signatures. Witnesses. A new will. One I'd never seen before. This version, dated just a week before Daniel died, left everything to Julia. The house. The business. The savings account. Even the lake cabin he bought for our retirement. I felt my knees weaken. My body wanted to sit but couldn't find a chair. The world tilted slightly. Like I was dreaming, but wide awake. "He changed his mind," she said. "He wanted to make sure I was okay. Said you'd be fine." I couldn't speak. All I could do was shake my head over and over, like that might erase what I was seeing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a clerical error. This was deliberate. I stared at the signature. Daniel's name, in ink. His handwriting, or something like it. But my heart screamed no. He would never do this. Not without telling me. Not without a conversation. Not without us. I said, "This isn't real. He wouldn't do this." And Julia tilted her head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "He didn't want to burden you," she said. "You were barely functioning. You still aren't." That's when I knew. This had been her plan all along. Not just to help. Not to grieve beside me. But to replace me. To crawl into the cracks Daniel's death left behind. And quietly take everything. Mr. Kane, Daniel's lawyer, looked stunned when I brought him the will. He'd never seen it before. His signature wasn't on it. And Daniel had always insisted we'd finalized everything together, months before the illness took hold. But legally, this new document had witnesses. A notary stamp. It looked legitimate. It didn't matter how my heart screamed. On paper, Julia now held everything. The house. The memories. The future we built. And I, his wife, was suddenly just a tenant. In my own life. I went to bed that night in Daniel's sweatshirt. Clutched the last photo we ever took. And for the first time since he died, I cried like the world was ending. Because in many ways, it had. There's a particular kind of silence that follows betrayal. It doesn't scream. It lingers. Like dust in a room that used to be alive. For days, I moved through the house like a ghost. Opening drawers just to close them again. Running the shower, only to sit on the floor beside it, still in my clothes. Julia walked around like she owned the place. Because legally, she did. She took Daniel's name off the mailbox. She moved his favorite chair into the garage. She started referring to the house as my property. And I stopped arguing. Stopped speaking, even. What was the point? But deep down, something refused to go quiet. A flicker. Faint. But there. One night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt unfamiliar, too sharp, too clean. I wandered into Daniel's old study, which Julia had already started turning into her home office. But she hadn't touched his laptop. It was still there, tucked behind the stack of medical bills she never bothered to file. The screen was cold, but the charger light blinked like it was waiting for something. I opened it. Typed in the password. Still worked. Of course it did. He never changed it, just used our anniversary. I didn't know what I was looking for. I think part of me just wanted to hear his voice again. To remember something untouched by her fingerprints. I clicked through folders. Invoices. Photos. Drafts of letters to clients he never sent. Then I saw it. A file named. For her, if anything happens. My heart stopped. It was an audio recording. Timestamped just 6 days before he died. After the date on the new will. My hands trembled as I pressed play. His voice came through, raspy but calm. Familiar. Wrecking. If you're hearing this, I guess something happened. I've been thinking about what to leave behind. Not just money or assets. But clarity. He paused. Coughs. Then continues. Everything I have belongs to her. My wife. She built this life with me. No one else. Julia, she's been around lately. I want to believe she means well. But I also know her. And if there's any confusion later, please don't let charm outweigh history. She doesn't get to rewrite what we built. I broke. Right there. Collapsed into the chair like I was being held by him one last time. This was proof. Not in numbers. Not in ink. But in his words. His truth. Unfiltered. Uncoached. Undeniable. I brought it to Mr. Kane the next morning. He listened in stunned silence. When it ended, he whispered. That changes everything. We dug deeper. Pulled phone records. Checked dates. Found that the notary listed on the second will? She'd lost her license 6 months earlier. And the so-called witnesses? 2 were friends of Julia's from a previous apartment, both with prior fraud charges. We subpoenaed her financials. Found large transfers, payments to names we didn't recognize. And one payment labeled consultation fee. The date matched the day she visited the lawyer without telling me. Piece by piece, her version of the truth collapsed. Daniel had never changed his will. The version Julia presented was a forgery. A desperate power grab, masked in fake sympathy. And finally, after all the silence, the gaslighting, the manipulation, I had something stronger than her lies. I had him. His voice. His intent. His love. He didn't just protect me in life. He found a way to protect me after. And this time, I was ready to fight back. The day we went to court, it was raining. Not hard, just enough to blur the edges of things. Like the sky was washing away everything that came before. Julia wore white. Can you believe that? A bright, polished white suit like she was walking into a press conference, not a reckoning. She didn't look at me. Not once. She sat tall. Smiling. As if the truth couldn't touch her. But the truth had a voice. Daniel's. And when the judge played that recording, the entire room shifted. You could feel it. The air turning heavy. The kind of silence that only honesty can bring. His words, soft and broken, cut through every lie she'd spun. You could see it on her face. The flicker. That split second where she knew. It was over. The lawyer laid everything out. The forged notary. The fake witnesses. The unexplained transactions. Each detail another nail in the story she tried to build over my grief. Julia barely spoke. When the judge finally asked if she had anything to say, she just shrugged. I was only doing what I thought was fair. Fair. That word echoed in my mind for days. Because there was nothing fair about any of it. But there was something better. Justice. The court reinstated Daniel's original will. Everything he intended came back to me. The house, the business, the lake cabin. But more than that, I got my truth back. My name. My place in the life we built. My voice. Julia was charged with fraud and forgery. She took a plea deal. No jail time, just a record and a debt she can't charm her way out of. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching her fall. Only a quiet kind of peace. The kind that comes when the world finally stops spinning long enough for you to stand. After the ruling, I went home. Sat in Daniel's chair. Played the recording one more time. I whispered. I kept my promise. I fought for us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. Because justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about remembering who you are. When someone tries to take everything. And in the end, Julia didn't get my house. She didn't get the money. She didn't even get my anger. She only got the silence she tried to bury me in. And I got my life back. It's strange how the story began with an envelope on a table and ended with a voice in a recording that saved me. I still remember the way Julia looked at me that day. Calm. Certain. As if she believed I'd never question her. As if grief would keep me quiet forever. But grief doesn't silence the truth. It reveals it. Eventually. I've thought a lot about what Daniel left me. Not just a house, or a business. But a belief in myself I didn't know I'd need one day. He knew me better than I knew myself. He knew I'd doubt. That I'd hesitate. That I'd hope too long before acting. So he left behind more than love. He left clarity. He left proof. He left a lifeline. And maybe that's what I want you to remember. That when something feels off, when someone you love suddenly casts a shadow where there used to be light, don't ignore it. Even if they're family. Especially if they are. Because manipulation doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it bakes banana bread. Sometimes, it wears your husband's hoodie and calls it love. But you'll know. Somewhere deep inside, you'll feel it. That flicker. That tightening. That quiet little voice saying, this isn't right. Listen to it. Hold on to it. Because one day, it might be all you have. And it just might be enough to save everything.